wonderful to be here with you today, David. I've been really, really looking forward to this conversation. Of course, we're going to be talking about all things digital transformation and the roadmap and the journey to get there and to stay there. That's the title of your excellent book, which follows your first book on the subject. And as somebody who's been involved in digital transformation with some successes and a few failures, I love the book. It's substantive. It obviously reflects more than a decade of experience on your part and the research you've done. It's very practical. And when I was reading it, I was thinking, yes, you've got it. As opposed to some books, which frankly are a bit superficial or too salesy. And that obviously reflects your own role, advising boards, leading workshops, working with a whole series of household names that we'll no doubt hear about here. And obviously you'll read about in the book. And, it just felt a very substantive, practical book. So many, many congratulations. I mean, as a topic, digital transformation evokes a lot of reactions, some emotions, but it's clearly central to the success, if not solvency, of many organizations. And often many people wonder why they've struggled to make it work after many failed attempts. So today in this episode, we're going to invite you to share your wisdom and distill your tips and experience and give us a sense of what you've written about in your excellent book. So welcome to the show, David.
Thanks so much, David. I'm really happy you've enjoyed the book, and it's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you on your show. Be a part of it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining. So let's just set this up before we drill down into some of the details. Now, digital transformation, it's a term that I often think about. I'm thinking, that's for the traditional incumbent organizations that are trying to catch up. Is that right? Or actually, does it apply to any organization?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I sort of set out a definition in my last book written 7 years ago, in which I talked about the changes that have to happen in companies that were established before the internet, right? But a funny thing happened over the years since then. What I learned is, as I interacted with more and more companies and really focused on what are these challenges that these established businesses are facing under this incredible tumult and change in the digital era, and how do they adapt and how they keep growing and thriving. I kept having companies who were like 10 years old, 15 years old, so technically digital natives come to me and join workshops I was leading of executives and other formats and seeking out my advice, and realized they were actually struggling with the exact same problem. So the thing is, digital, however we call it, the digital revolution, it is not a change that happened in 1994 or 96 or 2001 or 2008 or there's not sort of a single marker. We are in a period of continuous change and disruption. So the real challenge is for any established business. So a business that has customers already and revenue and distribution channels and an org chart and all these things that have been built around what's worked up to date. For those organizations, how do they stay flexible? How do they adapt as this change keeps coming? And so that's why I've shifted my definition over the years to now simply be, it is transforming an established business to thrive in this continuous digital change. And that's really the heart of it.
I love that. And that's really, really crystal clear. And let's just sort of set the scene. Paint the canvas, if you like. You set out 5 critical steps. Curious to know what they are at a sort of high level at this stage. And also, very importantly, how you actually think about and use those steps.
Sure. So this is kind of the guiding framework of the new book, the Digital Transformation Roadmap. So I call these the 5 steps of the roadmap. I'll say a little bit about sort of each one and then kind of how they work together. The first is absolutely essential, and that is to define a shared vision. And I see many companies have failed to do this, and they are embarking on a digital transformation, and maybe they've hired a chief digital officer and they've written some language about how they're going to become a digital first company. It's all very generic. And honestly, CEOs will confess to me, they say, look, if you actually ask 3 people in my company, what does digital transformation mean for us? You'll get 3 different answers, right? There's not a cohesive shared vision of what does this truly mean for us? So you have to define that. It's really critical. And I've done a lot of work with companies and looking at others to understand kind of what makes that work. How do you align people effectively? The second step that has to follow is you have to, what I call, pick the problems that matter most. This is about the discipline of picking priorities and priorities for growth, right? So I see companies who are either just going in all directions. They say, oh, we're going to be digital. And guess what? If you really take a look around you in the world today and see all the new capabilities coming on and the new kind of business models being tested and the changing customer needs across markets, you will come up with 100 ideas very easily. And the challenge is not to go off in 100 directions. So prioritizing what are the things that are really going to matter most to our business right now at this stage. And so we can say yes to those and say no to everything else, at least for now, in order to actually drive, some impact and some growth. The third step is, as you start to get that clarity of sort of vision and strategy where you're going, you have to really get good at what I call validating new ventures. That is really taking the methods and the mindset and the practices of things like agile software development, product management, design thinking, lean startup. This whole approach to innovating through rapid experimentation, which I've been writing about in my work for years, but how do you actually make that a habit and a process within an established business? Right? Yes. The fourth step is what I call managing growth at scale. So again, you're an established business, and particularly as you get larger and more complex, it is simply not enough to have some teams who are maybe trained in design thinking, or you've brought them in through an acqui-hire, and you've got some people who are talented and know how to, take a small multifunctional team and move fast on building a new product or functionality or customer experience. You actually have to be doing that across the organization, and you need to have an overview. You need to be investing and allocating resources across different kinds of priorities, not just the easy ones, those sort of low-hanging fruit that are, in the core business that's already established, or like really clear ROI and predictable results you're going to get in a near term because it's sort of a already solved problem, but also looking for growth in more uncertain opportunities. So how do you sort of manage and allocate people, resources, governance, oversight across these different opportunities? And then the fifth step is to grow technology, talent, and culture. So these are the three fundamental capabilities which you just have to invest in for the long term. If you don't, none of the things you've done before will have the reach and the sort of scale of impact that you hope for. But I also see a lot of folks try to rush and start there. They say, let's build our technology stack, but they don't even know what they're building it for, right? They don't know what their priorities are. They haven't actually gotten their feet wet, so to speak, standing up some small teams to actually move fast outside of the old kind of BAU, business as usual processes. They haven't done that work yet. And so they're just kind of going down a laundry list of good to have generic technologies. And it's just not going to be a smart investment of your resources, and you're not going to see the kind of direct measurable payback and growth.
And that's crystal clear. And I know one thing you're absolutely clear about is the fact that this is not necessarily sequential. You don't you go through 1 to 5 and then stop, and then you do the next 5 and
this
so
is
on.
not
Just
a
tell
process.
me a bit more about that.
Yes, yeah, thank you. So this is very much an iterative process. It is not okay. We do a plan, and then we spend a year on step 1 or 6 months on each, and then we finish our vision, and then we do our priorities, and then we're done with that, and then we generate a bunch of ventures. We're done. No, these all have to be happening simultaneously. Each one leads into the next. So you have to do some thinking about, some clarity about your vision before you can start picking priorities, right? And you have to pick some problems that you're going to at least initially focus on before you know where to stand up new ventures. Otherwise, you're just going to be doing random, interesting things that maybe any business could do, rather than things that are strategic opportunities that particularly fit your organization, its unique capabilities. So each one feeds into the other. But, my advice is you should have gone through all 5 steps in your first 90 days. And then you keep circling back. Based on what you've learned so far, you go back and reflect again on that vision and clarify it further. And then you look back at the priorities you defined and the maybe venture backlog of ideas you've generated. And then you start to reassess the ventures you've stood up. So it is an iterative process. Absolutely. The same way that building a digital product or a new digital business has to be iterative, organizational change. This is one of the key things I've learned over the years. It does not happen with a plan, top down. Hey, here's how we're going to revamp the entire business and change the way we operate. You can make that kind of deep organizational change happen, but it only happens in an iterative fashion where you learn through doing what works and what doesn't work in your own organization.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's interesting when you use the word digital transformation, for many people, not just the consultants, they think of large programs. And they think of multi-year exercises, and it's sort of, oh yeah, in 3 years' time we'll have digitally transformed. That's pretty quick in many cases.
Yeah.
But then they have to start again, and they have to start again, and they have to start again. They haven't built the muscle, if you like. So what does it take to sustain not only momentum, but all the things, the culture, the focus, the clarity? What does it take so it doesn't, if you like, you have a program and then you stop, and then you go back to where you were and you start again. How do you sustain it?
Yeah, this is critical. So I would point to a couple things. I mean, one is you have to understand what you're getting in for, right? This is not, this is not a 3-year project. That's a common question again that I heard from CEOs after my last book was, okay, we're going to do this. Can you give me some, a ballpark? Is this a 2-year or 3-year project, and how much is it going to cost? And that's the wrong way to think about this. I got a great analogy from a CEO I was meeting with earlier this year. The more we started to really look at what digital transformation meant for her organization, she said, you know what? I'm starting to see this is more like our commitment to climate change. Like, we have made a major commitment. We are moving towards a zero carbon future.
Yes.
We're not going to get there in 3 years. We don't know when we're going to get there. And so, and the analogy was that we are committing to this to the long haul. We have to believe in this, right? At the core of the organization, why we're doing this and know why we're doing it. It's not, we're going to check a box in 3 years and sort of be done. So you have to have that kind of understanding and commitment of why you're doing this. And then you also, to that point of how do you make it sort of self-sustaining? A few things. One, it has to be what I call a bottom-up approach, meaning it cannot purely or solely be led by top executives, sort of figuring out what we need to do and sort of explaining it and telling others what to do.
Yes.
It has to be, yes, you are going to be, the leader's job is, among other things, to sort of define where you're going and why. But then their job is not to micromanage. It's not to get into the trenches and tell each division, okay, this is what this looks like for you and how you need to bring this new approach to working to your supply chain or your product development process or your, Asian marketing team. These different parts of the organization have to take ownership, and they have to come up with the ideas themselves. So you have to make it a bottom-up approach. You need to change one of the big themes of this book, governance, right? It has to be, you have to change the processes, how you manage metrics, incentives for people in a way that it will enable and empower them. Because if you don't take a close look at governance, I guarantee the governance you've built for your established business, your core business, is going to put in major obstacles to the opportunity to pursue new opportunities.
It's going to suffocate it, isn't it? Because a lot of people are encouraged to pursue these new ventures and obviously deliver the new vision, but actually there's got a stranglehold of, actually that won't help me deliver against my KPIs, or they're effectively still operating in the core business.
Exactly. There's so many things, oh great, the team is approved and we just need to run a first pilot with this outside partner. Oh, terrific. That'll go to procurement. You'll have an answer in 6 months whether you can run that 3-week test, right? So this is the kind of thing that happens time and again. So it's got to be bottom up. You have to attend to the processes, what I call the governance. And then the last piece is you have to invest in the capabilities and most importantly in the people, because you've got to be attracting and retaining, which is frankly harder, the right kind of people. And if you do all that, the leadership can retire or move on and things can change. It's not that you need to have the person who sort of maybe oversaw the kicking off of this process is going to be there, 10 years from now as you're pushing into the next iteration of what comes next. But you're going to have put in place that, as you say, that, as you put it, I really like that self-sustainable muscle. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get even more real. Some names. So
Yeah.
you've got two questions, and it's just give me a nutshell answer on this sort of quick answer.
Mm-hmm.
One is the company you've most admired in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what they've done in digital transformation, and perhaps a company that isn't a household name to the degree of the big ones, like the Netflix and Disney's and others. So, which one do you admire? And the second one being which one might be less well known, but you think people should
Yeah.
learn more about.
Um, there's a lot that I admire, and a lot of different companies I can point to in terms of showing both humility and courage at the same time. Companies like Disney, like Walmart, like John Deere. One I keep coming back to because there's so much to learn from them is the New York Times.
Mm.
And I say there's so much to learn because, when I'm in the classroom with senior executives, that's the kind of teaching I do at Columbia. It it's kind of a brilliant case because they did everything wrong before they started to do everything right. So you see all the mistakes to be made, but you also see it's okay if you have started and things are not working and you've been beating your head against this wall in digital transformation. It's not all hope is lost. They really set out to digitize the core business. They thought this was about, okay, let's do operational efficiency and let's use new technologies as a mean to deliver the exact same product or service, the same value proposition to the customer as we always have. Very, very common sort of mistakes. Yes. They did not attend to culture whatsoever. They didn't build the fundamental capabilities around things like data and IT infrastructure. And so they kept doing stuff and they got awards, prizes, Pulitzers and so forth for, innovative projects and sort of pilots. There were lots of activity, but it wasn't addressing the fundamental problem. And the business model, the revenue was going down year after year because the problem was not about their distribution mechanism. The problem was the economics of information had totally changed.
Making some money.
How do you make money? It was just had been kind of turned on its head by the digital revolution. So they reached this kind of crisis point where they really kind of looked themselves in the eye. And then this wonderful thing happened, which was they had this in-depth internal report written, commissioned by the top leadership, and they sent out an investigative journalism team to basically talk to everyone inside and outside, competitors, partners, and really figure out what was actually going on. And it was a secret report for the, to 5 people, I think, at the top. And of course, in great journalistic fashion, tradition of that industry, it was leaked, right?
Yeah.
And so the whole industry read that report because they were all kind of waiting for the New York Times to figure it out. They saw them as like of course, they're the smart guys. They'll figure this. And it was just kind of an earth-shaking moment when it was clear that, the emperor had no clothes. And what that meant internally was there was no longer any argument that, well, we can just kind of stick to our knitting and stay what we've done before and just kind of make a little changes around the edge. Everyone recognized we had to approach this in a much more fundamental way. And that's when things really started to change. And there's so much to learn from what they're doing today. Now, a contrasting example, I guess you're contrasting one, not as well known, industrial business. Non-American. I would point to a company I really admire is Air Liquide. So that's an industrial business that produces gases for industrial applications in factories, healthcare, and elsewhere. Now, they're not facing that kind of digital disruption. The economics of the industry have not evaporated, right? So very, very different context, right? Different kind of pressure, not the same kind at all. And yet they have been really smart about thinking about how do we define what is the growth opportunity for digital for our particular organization? How do we take, among other things, all the data that can be captured across this incredible range of assets, from factories to gas canisters and all over the world, and all kinds of supply chains? How do we take a new collaborative approach to working across our current partners, but also with a broader ecosystem? Really looking at the particular growth opportunities that make sense for them and their business, and building up that, and really engaging folks at different parts of the organization until this became, and also with structures, new processes and governance and resource allocation and investing in people. Really a very different organization today than it was about 5 years ago when I first met the fellow Olivier Delabroy, who had been tapped to sort of figure out what the heck is digital transformation for a French industrial gas company.
That's fascinating, and that's super impressive, inspirational.
Yeah.
Both stories. You touched there on some critical decisions along the way in terms of the journey and the roadmap, and I'm fascinated by your experience of working with boards because
Mm.
clearly they play a fundamentally important role.
Mm.
What do they need to get right, and what do they need to avoid in the journey and along the roadmap?
Sure. I mean, I actually, just to be clear for those who have read my work, I talk about two different kinds of boards. One is I talk about growth boards, which is a mechanism
Yes.
for oversight of the teams who are actually iteratively testing and building new uh, growth models for the company. And that's a really critical piece of the process that is frequently elevated, attempted to be run much too high. So people will put their senior executive team and they think that's who should greenlight all new innovation projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is just not how they don't have the bandwidth to give the level of attention to iterative funding and to counsel and so forth. So you have to set up that kind of board, which is going to have a mix of people, senior level, different backgrounds within the organization, ideally folks from outside, and they have a really critical oversight and support role. But the board of directors, absolutely, of course, has another really important role. From my conversations with boards, I think there are three critical questions that they have to ask. And to me, this is their most important job. Questions are really undervalued in terms of leadership and how we've traditionally taught it in
Absolutely
business
right.
schools. But for boards, they have to be asking, first of all, what is the upside of digital for us? Right? Not for some other company, not for some interesting, sexy industry that's in the news, but for our particular organization. Right? You have to be asking that, and honestly, to be really engaged, they have to have some kind of an answer in mind of that. The second is they have to be always asking, what is the risk of inaction? Right? What is the risk if we do nothing, if we just sort of stay the course and keep with what we've been doing? There's a real common trap, which Phil Bobbitt at Columbia Law School famously dubbed the Parmenides fallacy, which is the fallacy of believing that you should compare a future new idea, course of action. Well, we could make this big bet or move in a certain direction or hire this, senior executive, whatever the decision is, thinking of comparing a new action against the current state of the company. Right. And the implicit, and this is just basic human psychology, our natural way of thinking is we just assume that tomorrow is going to look like today. And you have to train yourself to think about how if we don't do anything, tomorrow is not going to look like today. It is going to go dramatically in a different direction very quickly. And you need to have that clarity of that. And that starts to really bring about this view of the risk of inaction. I mean, a lot of boards I ask that, they'll say things like, "Oh, our competitors will steal market share," which is absolutely true. That's sort of an easy thing to point to.
Yes.
Or maybe more seriously, if they're feeling a bigger pace of change, we could be irrelevant to our customers and go out of business. They don't always at first identify some of the other risks, such as you will not be able to attract the talent that you need to simply run your company in the modern economy if you don't make this kind of change. The third question, which boards have to be asking constantly, is, so first, what's the upside of digital, of investing in a digital transformation? Second, what's the risk of inaction, of just kind of staying the course? Third, what's holding us back? So many companies, so many boards I've heard, the best informed ones, they can answer the first two, right? Well, yeah, we see why this is important. And okay, we have some sense of why we really can't afford to kind of play it cautious and safe here. What's holding you back? And usually there's a big silence there. The operators have a little more ideas, and the people down in the trenches can give you a long list of what's holding them back every single day from trying to do what is clearly in the best interest of the company. So that becomes an ongoing question the board has to really be continually seeking out and trying to find out in order to support the CEO and the top management team, is to be saying, hey, what is holding us back? What's the current barrier? What's the obstacle that we're facing? And then support the leadership team in terms of, okay, how do we address that?
Yeah. It's interesting, that last one. There's often legacy activities, assets, mindsets But then even if you identify, though, I guess there's a concern about the transition to the new and how to manage that. But let's just continue on the board front. I mean, what's the biggest shifts that you see in leaders of transformation, whether they're in the growth board, the people really making their decisions and rolling their sleeves up, whether it's bottom up. But if you had to encapsulate one, I'll give you maybe one or two. Go on, I'm being generous. One or two big shifts in, it could be their mindset, it could be their practices. What would you call out as they're going through some form of digital transformation?
So for leaders in general, there's a real shift required in terms of how we define and think about leadership. And one of the big ways of thinking about this is the imperative for leaders to push decisions down. This is something that digital native organizations that have really succeeded at scale have managed to do. And that's why they're still able to move relatively fast. Not that they're perfect, the Googles and the Amazons and Metas and Apples of the world, but by comparison, they're able to move faster and allocate and pursue opportunities beyond their sort of immediate core business is because they are really focused on pushing decision-making down to the lowest level possible in the organization. Leaders need to embody certain traits. I would say the most important qualities I would look for someone, and the higher up, the more leadership responsibility you have, the more important these are. One is humility. Right? That doesn't mean you're tentative, but it means you recognize how much you don't know. And not you personally, but just how much is unknown for the organization, right? How much uncertainty you're really dealing with, and not being sort of guided by a false confidence. So humility, you have to be a great communicator. Really effective leaders are really good at telling stories. They know how to not just, lists and bullet points on a slide. They know how to communicate in a way that's going to resonate and kind of take root in people's minds and their hearts and their day-to-day working. And they also have to be great listeners. I mean, empathy. You have to be open to really good at learning from others. Curiosity has to be a part of that. You'll never be a great listener and a great empath without that. But I think of those as kind of absolutely essential traits for leaders today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, you referred earlier, David, to ecosystems, and I'm curious to understand how much you think the proliferation of ecosystems and some platform-based ecosystems has changed the way digital transformation is affected. Is it a feature and evolution of the approach, or has it fundamentally changed the way that transformation has to be done?
Well, I think it's really critical for any leader today has to be familiar with and have a really good grounding and understanding what we would call platform business models or multi-sided business models was the original sort of name. Ecosystem is kind of a broad, kind of a vaguer term. It's sort of a different way of thinking about maybe industry without necessarily taking an old sort of simplistic definition where there's sort of clear boundaries of sort of when you're in one industry or you're in another, right? That was how we defined competition and for decades. So the old classic models, five forces and so forth were based on these kind of rigid industries that could be clearly defined. Platforms are really interesting because they are capable of tremendous growth when they succeed. They are not, let me be clear, some people sort of try to oversell this as like everything digital as a platform. Not all successful business models in the digital era are platform business models. But when they do succeed, and in fact, in many ways, they are the trickiest to pull off. But when they do succeed, they are capable of growing at a much faster rate than any other. So they're extremely important. And for established businesses, I always try to make sure folks understand a couple things. One is to understand how a platform business model changes the dynamics of competition. And they're a big driver of why I say today businesses can't think about simply about the old model of competition. You have to think about what you call it co-opetition, right? Competing and cooperating with the same business at the same time. Or thinking about both what I call symmetric competitors and asymmetric competitors. But even if you're not a platform yourself, the presence of them in your related space changes those dynamics. And so you cannot think in that old linear, may the best car win, a zero-sum game, we're going to beat them kind of, framing of what your mission is as an organization, this kind of old kind of definition of competition. And the other thing is, even if you have an established core business that's an integrated, vertically integrated, sort of more traditional business model, and probably going to stay that way, these multi-sided, these platform business models may be really important to you as you think about growth opportunities. As you start thinking about where you're going to grow beyond your current business, it's a mindset shift to think, well, here's what we do well. There's an opportunity here. Well, if we go after that, what are all the things we have to do? What are all the resources we need and capabilities? And you may not need to do that all yourself, right? It is a different way to say, could we be the sort of orchestrator of a new value proposition by bringing together other parties? We give up some control, we give up some of the profit, but it may actually enable a much more effective, more resilient, more robust, ecosystem of players who are creating the value together, a better offering for the customers, and if you succeed, a faster growing, more resilient, and more dominant position even for your own business, even though you were sort of willing to share more of it from the start.
Yes. Let's continue on that theme, because another big topic in the business world over the last year in particular has been the rise of artificial intelligence.
Sure.
Been around for a very long time, but there's been obviously a fascination with one aspect of artificial intelligence in terms of generative AI. Again, with that lens, I've heard various executives and spent time with various executives saying, "Oh, that's one technology, loosely called, that we may use in our digital transformation." Others have said, that radically changes, without defining it really, radically changes the way we do our transformation efforts. Where do you sit on that fence?
I think for most businesses, the better starting point would be the first that you described. So artificial intelligence, first of all, to be clear in terms of terminology, it's not a technology. It's a very broad kind of description of class of category. It's been around for decades. And there have been different approaches, different kinds of tools and technologies that have been applied, from decision trees and other kinds of learning systems. There's kind of this natural historical progression of it's called the artificial intelligence effect, which is that whatever is seen as artificial intelligence today, oh my God, it's so incredible. This tool can do this thing that before only humans could do. In a year or two, it's just ho hum, and that's just a product.
Yes.
It's like, oh yeah, of course,
Absolutely.
right? Of course, it can translate, from one language to another. Of course, it can listen to my spoken speech and do that. A search engine was AI when it first started. It's emulating what, when I was a kid, a reference librarian would do, right? I would go to the local county library and I'd walk up and I would ask the reference librarian, I'm interested in this topic and I want to learn about it. What are the most important, resources I should start with? And they would help put together, here's a list of books to go read. Now that's what a search engine does, right? So it's a moving target. But within AI, obviously there's been really now two very important kind of waves of kind of new technologies in the last decade or so. First was this breakthrough around pattern recognition, and we saw with machine vision and natural language processing and recognition, and other tools that can, semantic recognition. So first, listening to speech and translating that into words, but second, being able to say, read a 1,000 medical case histories and actually derive, information from that, so that then when you show an MRI image to that machine learning system, it can make a predictive assessment. Well, the most likely diagnosis, doesn't know any more than the doctor does, but the most likely diagnosis would be, stage 3 this, and the second most likely would be stage 2 that. Those systems, we had an incredible breakthrough, and there was a lot of excitement about it. And then for years, we were trying to figure out how do you actually turn that into a business. And basically, when it got boring and was no longer sexy and people were not talking about it, that's when it really started to impact almost every business we know. So there's kind of this lag from the hype cycle to true business impact that's pretty common in a lot of technologies. Now, of course, we're in another wave, the large language models, most particularly, but more broadly, generative AI, rather than predicting and making matching patterns. It's machine learning that is able to look at a corpus of information and with prompts, of course, create things. I think for organizations, how we should be thinking about this is one, this is a very interesting and fast evolving capability, right? That
Yes.
is now out there in a way that wasn't very a short while ago. So we all have to be. Any organization needs to be tracking, getting up to speed on this very well. What is it doing? How is it being used in various sectors beyond my own, and so forth? What does this capability look like? What are its limits? Very very particular limits. Depending on what you're trying to do, the balance of what it's good at right now and what it's terrible at, you might say, oh my gosh, of course we should be, our entire, I don't know, marketing team or some other, every single person should be trained on this by the end of the month. Or you may look at this and say, in our business, we can't touch this with a 10-foot pole right now, or at least for this kind of application because of the, the downside risks. So you've got to be assessing it as a capability. You need to be looking at it as a tool to solve problems. And that's the question you should be constantly saying is, okay, what are the problems we're trying to solve right now for our customers, for our business? And be looking and say, hey, is there a way we could adapt this, right? The real power of these tools is never the off-the-shelf version that you just get through the app, through the browser and so forth. It's when it gets productized and built and is a lot of work is actually done to customize it around a particular business problem. And that allows you to avoid what I would call the shiny object syndrome, which is, the CEO walks into your office, David, and says, I need your help figuring out my AI strategy, right? Or I need help with my ChatGPT strategy, right? ChatGPT is not a strategy. Blockchain was not a strategy. Metaverse was not a strategy. That's what you want to avoid. That's the main thing you want to avoid. But depending on the industry you're in, you may assess, hey, given like what our core competency is and the early progress we've had in applying this tool, we think this is going to transform like a great deal of our work. That may well be your assessment, but that should be based on actually testing and iteratively, applying it in your own business and seeing what differences it makes. It shouldn't just be based on the fact that, VCs threw $1 trillion at it and therefore it's the big thing. And therefore you should imagine you're going to reorient your entire organization around it.
Yeah. Very wise. Such great advice. So let's just change tack for a moment. 3 quick-fire, completely unreasonable questions on my part, but you have to choose one of the answers, even if you don't like it.
Okay.
So the first one is, you mentioned it earlier, Chief Digital Officer, necessary or redundant in a digital transformation?
I would say good at the start. Right. I've seen a lot of organizations. It can be very helpful to have sort of a right hand, person to the CEO who is really working with the CEO to sort of define that vision and the priorities and to start to, be able to really work full time on doing things like figuring out what are the pieces of governance we need to start rethinking, et cetera. Really most of their job it's not about a command and control job. It's about aligning people, somebody with great political skills, people skills, engaging people at different parts of the organization. The companies who I see where that kind of chief digital officer has been there and has done a great job, they move away from that model at some point. They don't really need it. It's now embedded in the organizations. It can be very valuable.
All right. I love the way you break the rules with a very elegant answer. I love that. That's fantastic.
Sorry,
all right. Stick to the rules. No, the second one, the hardest, starting new ventures or making smart shutdowns, to use your terms. Choose just one of them.
That's easy. No question. It's much harder to make smart shutdowns.
Okay.
We all love to brainstorm and come up with ideas. It's really hard for organizations to be good at shutting things
to do
down.
That. Nobody wants to focus on it. The last one, the biggest leadership failure, overconfidence or laziness?
I would say overconfidence. That is much worse. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't really see a real problem with lazy leaders. It's not sort of an endemic issue. I think there are people who don't know what they should be doing. And that might present as laziness, but it's because they actually don't realize what their job is supposed to be. But overconfidence is such a severe problem and frankly quite common in leadership, and it can be so costly.
Yeah. Let's just, as we turn on to you for a moment, I'm curious. You've set out some brilliant tools in this book, which are very practical, very usable. Just give us a teaser. That means short. A teaser of one that you're particularly proud of that you think people should go and look at and use.
So what I'm really proud of is the four stages of validation. And this is
Mm,
a problem I've seen up close with all kinds of teams, some standalone startups, a lot inside organizations trying to drive innovation. And they get the idea that, okay, we need to experiment. We need to be honest about the uncertainty and all the hypotheses that are untested about this business model. And then if you get that mindset, suddenly you've got this incredibly long list of things you recognize that you don't know and that you need to somehow validate. Who's the
mm,
customer? What's the problem? Who's the competition? What's the price point? What's the total addressable market? Down the line, it keeps going and going and going. And it sort of boggles the mind. Okay, where do we get started?
yes.
So this is a real serious problem I've seen time and again. And I guess I would say I'm proud of or really eager to share this model, the four stages of validation, because what it does is it simply organizes that. It's a model for sequencing. How do we get started? What are the questions we need to answer first that will then lead to the next set of important questions that will then lead to the next set of important questions? And this has come not from me sitting in my room. It's been drawing on so much insight from incredible thinkers like Steve Blank and Bob Dorff,
Mm,
and many others. But Steve and Bob, I've had the chance to not only read their work, but to be in the room with them, leading teams, coaching them, teaching in some of my Columbia programs, and then just working with teams in many different organizations on my own. It's a model that's probably gone through the most iteration of all the tools in the book
yes.
to really
Often the
sort
best
of
way.
figure out that clarity of, because you want to give guidance because that's what everyone is asking for and so kind of spinning their wheels. But I didn't want to be overly sort of programmatic because it's got to be a model that will work if you're a startup or you're an enterprise, if it's
Yeah, I love that.
B2B or it's consumer. If it's an internal innovation and you're simply trying to sort of, we have an idea for a new process internally that we think is going to improve the way we work. How do you actually validate that? So that's a model of four
I love
stages of
that.
validation. I'm
Yeah,
really,
that's
really
brilliant.
excited about.
I love
Yeah.
the fact it's being used and iterated so much. And what is the single biggest aspect of your contribution to digital transformation that you think people value?
Well, I mean, I think what I hear from you know leaders I've worked with and people I've had in the classroom, I think they value the practicality. That my approach is not to write a book like the digital transformation roadmap that just asks big questions and then lays out the answers in principle, which is, I think,
Mm,
important. You've got to look at first principles, but
yes.
then actually gives you, because not everybody can afford to come to Columbia. Not everybody can certainly afford to bring me to their company. So I want anyone who reads the book to be able to apply this. And so I take the time to put these tools in every single chapter to show you, like, how can you do this on your own without David Rogers?
Yeah.
The second, I think people appreciate that I approach the topic with a very sort of holistic view. That, as we talked
Yes.
about, it's
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
strategy, it's about leadership, it's about mindset, it's about governance, it's about culture. It's not one thing, but these
Oh,
things are
it's so
all kind of
refreshing.
interrelated. And then, I was just talking with a former client recently, and she said, she used the word provocative, and it's true. I think I tend to challenge some of the conventional wisdom around
Right.
digital transformation, around digital technology, around organizational change. I think I've just always been kind of a bit of a, I don't know if it's unorthodox thinker. I just don't believe it until I see it's true. Right? If somebody tells me something, I say,
Such a great mindset.
"Is that really the case?" I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Such a great. I love that provocateur. And then lastly, when you're having your best day at work, you're absolutely smashing it. You're being the most provocative. You're seeing patterns, themes. People are just thinking, "Wow, where did he come from?" What are the habits or practices that help you do that?
I guess a few things. One thing is I think I try to structure my days. So I try to start. I'm very conscious now about what I call my thinking work, and that could be something like writing, or just when you set out things you're going to do this week. There's certain things that require like quick decision making or communication or interaction with somebody, and other things that really require a lot of sustained attention and thinking through a problem. And I always
Mm,
schedule those as the very first thing of my day.
Yeah.
And to do that, I try to make sure before I go to bed, I plan, high level, what am I trying to do tomorrow? So I know those things because I know it's so easy to start off replying to what's in your inbox and something that's sort of urgent and momentary. But so that's one thing I find really helps. Another that's relatively new to me the last few years is exercise. 6 days a week, I exercise in the morning. And that was something I never really did very well in my life until recently. And what happened was I stopped doing it to sort of be, I don't know, it's interesting motivations. I stopped doing it to be physically fit. I did it for my mental health and during lockdown. And now I'm more physically fit than I've ever been, but I don't do it for that. I do it because that's the reward, is the mental release. And the last thing I would say is I try to find, just find great people to partner with, people who compliment me, and not giving me fulsome praise, but who are different. Their viewpoint or their skills or the things they do, the way they look at a problem or a question is different. They bring in something that I don't have, and just surround yourself with those kinds of people and try to make sure they're doing their best work. Do whatever I can to help them, and I find I just get so much out of those kinds of partnerships and working with them.
That sounds fantastic. David, I love your clarity of thought. You're very articulate. I love the spirit and the energy, and the fact that you convey the intricacies of digital transformation in a way that's accessible without simplifying. I think you are brilliant. I think your book and your books are must use, not just must read. And the richness of it, I've reread both of them and thinking, I didn't know that example. I thought I knew that company very well, full of really practical tools. Yeah. I've loved speaking with you today. So I'm very, very grateful for your time. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, David. It's really been a pleasure. And I look forward to keeping in touch and continuing to learn from each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that was another edition of Lanceford on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes in the series. Sign up to the YouTube channel and to the podcast. And if you're feeling generous, give me a lovely rating, 5 stars, if you would. David, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.